She did not flinch when the raiders came. Every soul in that tavern shattered. Every soul but one. London's most feared duke had been watching from the shadows. He did not leave a name. He left a gold sovereign. And Kitty Marlowe, who had survived everything London had thrown at her, knew, with absolute certainty, that the coin was the most dangerous thing in the room. If you love slow burn romance, dangerous secrets, and heroines who bow to no one, follow for the full story and leave a comment. Would you have stayed calm? London, November 1807. The world is at war beyond the Channel. In the streets of the city, quieter wars are fought every night. The Black Stag Tavern had never been accused of elegance. It sat at the crooked elbow of Aldgate Street like a man too tired to stand straight, its sign creaking in the November wind, its windows fogged with the breath of sailors, merchants, and men who had no wish to be found. On the best of nights, it smelled of tallow candles and old ale. On the worst of nights, which were most nights, it smelled of everything else London preferred not to think about. Kitty Marlowe had worked there since she was 16. She was 22 now, and she had learned that the best way to survive a room full of men who underestimated her was to let them keep doing it, right up until the moment it stopped being useful. She was behind the bar when they came in, 3 of them, then 4, then 6. She counted without looking directly, the way she had learned to count anything dangerous: coins, debts, threats. They wore no livery, no colours, nothing to identify them to a magistrate afterward. The man at the front had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and he wore it the way some men wore medals, deliberately, as an argument. The room did what rooms do when violence enters uninvited. It collapsed. A merchant near the window knocked over his chair getting up. 2 dock workers scrambled toward the back passage. The barmaid Agnes dropped a full tray of pewter cups and then stood in the ruins of it, hand pressed to her mouth, making no sound at all. Kitty set down the glass she was polishing. The scarred man's name, she would learn later, was Holt. He wanted 2 things: the week's earnings from the strongbox under the bar, and the whereabouts of a man named Cress, a smuggler who apparently used the Black Stag as an occasional address. He communicated both of these desires by pressing a pistol flat against the bar top and sliding it toward Kitty's hands like an invitation. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "The strongbox," she told him, with the tone of a woman explaining something to a child who ought to know better, "has 11 shillings and 4pence in it. You're welcome to it. As for Cress, he hasn't been in since Thursday last, and when he is here, he drinks alone in the corner and tells nobody anything, which is why he's been coming here for 3 years without incident. You've managed to ruin that record in under 2 minutes. Holt blinked. It was, by all accounts, not the response he had been anticipating. "Where?" he said, very carefully. "Does he sleep?" "I'm a barmaid," Kitty said. "Not his landlady. I pour the drinks. I don't follow the men home afterward." There was a beat of silence. One of Holt's men laughed, a short, surprised sound, bitten off quickly when Holt turned to look at him. What happened in the next 4 minutes was a negotiation, though it would not have looked like one to anyone watching. Kitty gave them the strongbox. She named 2 streets where Cress had been seen, streets she knew, with certainty, he never used. She kept her voice level, her hands visible, and her expression perfectly, deliberately neutral. She was not brave in the way that people imagine bravery. She was not unafraid. She was terrified. But she had learned, years ago, that terror and stillness were not mutually exclusive, and that the stillness was the only thing she had any control over. When the men left, not entirely satisfied, but satisfied enough, the room let out a breath it had been holding for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Agnes began to cry. The merchant righted his chair. The dock workers came back from the passage looking sheepish. Kitty went back to polishing the glass. She did not notice the man in the far corner until he moved. A shift of weight, barely perceptible, a shadow rearranging itself into the shape of a person. He had been there the entire time. She was almost certain of it. He had a glass of brandy in front of him that had not been touched. and he was watching her with an expression that was not quite readable from this distance. Not admiration, not amusement, not the proprietary interest that men in taverns usually directed at women behind bars. It was something more unsettling than any of those things. It was the expression of a man who had just solved a problem he hadn't known he had. He left without speaking. She heard the door, felt the gust of November air, and when she looked up, he was gone. On the bar, where his brandy glass had been, there was a single gold sovereign. Kitty stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up, turned it over once, and put it in her apron pocket, with the careful, unhurried movements of a woman who did not intend to make anything of it. Even though some part of her, the part that had learned to count threats, was already counting this one. He returned 3 days later. This was not, in itself, remarkable. Men returned to the Black Stag regularly. It was that kind of establishment, designed for repeat custom and the comfort of the familiar. What was remarkable was the way the room changed when he walked in. It was the same quality of change as when the raiders had entered, but in the precise opposite direction, where Holt's arrival had made the room collapse inward. This man's arrival made it hold absolutely, unnaturally still. Kitty had been in London long enough to recognize the particular stillness that power produced. She had just never seen it worn this quietly before. He was tall. That registered first, because tall men usually use their height differently, as punctuation or as warning, and he used it as neither. He simply occupied the space he was in, completely, the way a piece of furniture does, except that no piece of furniture had ever carried itself with that particular quality of contained force. He wore black, as he had 3 nights ago. He wore it like he had never considered wearing anything else. He sat down at the same table in the far corner. He looked at her across the room with the air of a man who had nowhere better to be, which she did not believe for a single second. She brought him brandy. Not because she was obliging, she was rarely obliging, but because she wanted a closer look. "You left something on my bar," she told him, setting the glass down. "I left payment," he said, "for the brandy." The brandy was 4 pence. She pulled the sovereign from her apron and set it beside his glass. "That's not what this is." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of an impulse toward one, quickly suppressed. Then what is it? "I haven't decided yet." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which was either very professional or extremely inappropriate depending on one's perspective. "Who are you?" He looked at her for a moment, assessing, she thought, not the question, but whether she actually wanted the answer. "Frederick Stanhope," he said finally, Duke of Ashmore. Kitty absorbed this information the way she absorbed most information, without visible reaction, storing it somewhere useful. "The Duke of Ashmore," she repeated. "I've heard that name. Most people have. They say you ruined the Halcourt family in a single week, called in every debt simultaneously and left the lot of them without so much as a carriage horse. They owed the debts. They say you fought Lord Pemberton's son at dawn and shot the pistol out of his hand rather than killing him, and then told him the lesson was free of charge. He was 19. A pause, and a poor shot. They say," Kitty continued, "that no one in London society will cross you directly, which means all the crossing gets done behind your back, which means you already know about most of it." This time he did look at her differently, not with the assessing quality of before, but with something that had more weight to it, genuine attention, the kind that meant she had said something he hadn't expected. It didn't feel like a compliment exactly. It felt like being accurately identified. "What do you want?" she asked. "Because you didn't come back here for the brandy." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cart rattled over the cobblestones, and a dog barked once and was silent. "The men who came here 3 nights ago," he said, "work for someone I've been looking for. The smuggler crest is a thread in a larger problem. I need to find that thread. And you think I can help you?" "I think," he said, with a precision that was almost impersonal, that you are more observant than anyone in this room has ever given you credit for. I think you know things about the traffic in and out of this establishment that no one has thought to ask about, because no one has thought to look at you carefully enough. A pause. I was watching you the other night. You counted them when they came in. You redirected them to streets that sounded plausible, but were almost certainly wrong. You bought time, gave them something, and lost them nothing critical. Another pause. That is a specific skill. Where did you learn it? Kitty looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My brother Thomas is in the Marshalsea, debtor's prison. He's been there for 14 months. The Duke did not say he was sorry. She respected that. The men who said they were sorry while doing nothing had become a particular category of useless in her internal accounting. "I want him moved to better conditions," she said. "More food, a proper bed, access to paper and pen, whatever influence you have, and I suspect it is considerable, directed toward making his situation less like a slow death and more like a temporary inconvenience. In exchange for that, I will tell you everything I know about Cress, about the men who come through here, about which ships use which wharves, and about the routes I've watched goods travel through this part of the city for the past 6 years. Frederick Stanhope looked at her across the table with an expression that she would think about later, in the small hours when the tavern was empty and the candles had burned low. It was not admiration. Exactly. It was the expression of a man who had spent a very long time in rooms full of people performing various versions of cleverness, and had just encountered, unexpectedly, the real thing. "Done," he said. "I'll need proof," Kitty told him. "Not a sovereign this time. A letter with your seal on it, confirming the arrangement. I've had enough of men's word to know what it's worth without witnesses." He reached into his coat. The letter, already written, she noted, which meant he had anticipated this conversation more precisely than she had credited, was sealed in black wax with an impression she recognized as the Ashmore crest. He set it on the table. She read every word before she picked it up. They met after closing for the next 2 weeks, a pattern that would have scandalized half of London if half of London had known about it, which it didn't, because the Black Stag's remaining patrons were the sort of people who minded their own business as a matter of professional self-interest. He came after 11. She would already have sent Agnes home and bolted the front door, and she would leave the side door on the latch and set a candle in the window as though she always did. He would sit at the corner table and she would sit across from him, and they would talk. He talked about almost nothing personal. She was not surprised by this. Men like him, men whose value lay in knowing things other people didn't, tended to treat information about themselves as the most expensive currency, the kind you didn't spend unless you absolutely had to. He asked questions. He listened to the answers with a quality of attention that was almost physical. Complete stillness, eyes fixed on her face, nothing wasted. She had met interrogators who were less thorough, but she was watching him too. She noticed the way he held his glass, loosely, not the grip of a man who used drink for comfort. She noticed that he arrived from different directions each time, and that he always sat with his back to a wall. She noticed the faint discoloration on the inside of his right wrist, partially concealed by his cuff, the kind of mark a cord leaves, the kind of cord used to restrain someone who knows how to break conventional restraints. She noticed, most of all, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, in the way of someone who had been about to say something true and caught himself before it escaped. "You're not just investigating Cress," she said one evening, near the end of the 2nd week. "This is larger than a smuggler." He said nothing for a moment. The candle between them guttered in a draught from somewhere, and the shadows rearranged themselves across his face. "Each of what makes you say that?" "Because you already know where Cress sleeps," she said. "You probably have done for weeks. Men in your position don't spend 2 weeks talking to a barmaid about docking schedules when they could simply pick up a smuggler and have someone ask him questions in a dark room. You're not looking for Cress. You're looking for whoever Cress works for. And you need to know what information has already passed through these walls without alerting the people who passed it. The quality of his stillness changed. She had learned to read him in small gradations. It was the only way to read him at all. This was the stillness of someone recalibrating. "I want to know something," she said, before he could decide not to answer. "Thomas, my brother. Before he was arrested for debt, he worked as a clerk for a shipping company, Marlowe and Crane, off the Bishopsgate. Was he mixed up in whatever this is?" "Why do you ask?" "Because the debt that put him in the Marshalsea was manufactured. I know it was. I couldn't prove it, but I know it. The way you know when someone is lying to you. Not because of what they say, but because of the shape of it. The way the pieces don't quite fit. Someone wanted Thomas somewhere he couldn't talk. I've been trying to understand why for 14 months. Frederick set down his glass. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the assessing attention, not the precise professional focus. Something that had more cost to it. "I don't have all the answers to that question," he said slowly, as though measuring each word against some internal standard of truth. "But I believe the debt was arranged by someone connected to the network I'm investigating. The company Thomas worked for was used to move correspondence, letters that were not what they claimed to be. He may have seen something without knowing he saw it." Kitty sat with this for a long moment. Outside, London breathed and shifted, indifferent as always. "Then we want the same thing," she said. "It appears so. That should make this easier." She stood up and began to clear the glasses. "Or considerably more complicated. I haven't decided which." She had her back to him when he said it, very quietly, almost as though it were not for her. "I am sorry. About your brother. About the 14 months. She kept her hands moving. She did not turn around because she did not want him to see what the apology did to her face, not because it was a weakness, but because it was real, and real things felt dangerous to expose just then. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Help me fix it." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in December 1807, written in a hand she didn't recognize, on paper that cost more than most people's weekly wage. It instructed her to come to an address in Mayfair at 7 o'clock that evening, and to dress, if possible, as though she had not just finished a shift at a tavern. She arrived at the address in a dress she had borrowed from Mrs. Hatch, who ran the second-hand shop on Mincing Lane. Deep green wool, a little out of fashion, but well made and serious-looking, which was all she had asked for. Frederick met her at the door personally, which surprised her. She had expected a footman. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. She could not quite interpret the look, which irritated her, because she was usually good at this. "You'll do," he said. "That," she told him, walking past him into the hall, "is the least gracious thing anyone has ever said to me, and I once had a man throw a chicken bone at my head. The second least gracious, then." The carriage took them to a house in Grosvenor Square, the town residence of a viscount, who hosted a monthly gathering of what society called persons of interest, and what Frederick called, very quietly, in her ear as they ascended the steps, "everyone who owes me something useful." He introduced her as Miss Catherine Marlowe, a cousin from Wiltshire. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever questioned the Duke of Ashmore. Kitty had grown up knowing, abstractly, that a world of this kind existed above the one she inhabited. She had never been inside it. She had expected it to feel like something she had always been told it would feel like. Overwhelming, dazzling, too much light and too much silk and too much of everything. It felt, instead, like a slightly larger version of the Black Stag, with better furniture. The games were the same. The alliances and enmities were the same. The people who drank too much and said too much, and the people who drank nothing and said nothing and collected information like interest on a loan. She recognized every type. She had been serving them for 6 years. The only difference was the clothes. She moved through the rooms with Frederick at a carefully maintained distance, close enough to be connected, far enough to be independent, and she listened. She was extraordinarily good at listening, She had a quality of apparent attentiveness toward whoever was speaking to her, a way of looking at a person that made them feel they were the most interesting thing in the room, which meant they usually told her more than they intended to. It was Lady Forsyth who first attempted to draw blood, in the way that women like Lady Forsyth did, with a smile on top and the knife underneath. "Wiltshire," she said, in a tone that made a county sound like an accusation. "How charming! And which family, precisely? In Wiltshire?" "The Marlowe Havishams," Kitty said, without hesitation. "The older branch. Rather quiet. We've always preferred it that way." "I don't believe I've heard of them." "No," Kitty agreed pleasantly. "You wouldn't have. We've never been very interested in being heard of. It seems exhausting." Lady Forsyth opened her mouth and then, finding nothing useful in it, closed it again. Frederick had been half a room away during this exchange. When Kitty drifted back in his direction, she was almost certain that the expression she caught on his face in the moment before he arranged it into something more neutral, that brief, private flash of something, was the closest thing to delight she had seen from him yet. It was near 10 o'clock when she saw him. He was standing near the fireplace, in conversation with a man in naval uniform, and he was so thoroughly unremarkable in his appearance, middle height, comfortable weight, forgettable features, that she might have passed him 100 times, except that she had seen him before. She had seen him once, 6 years ago, in the corridor of a courthouse in the city, pressing a folded note into the hand of the judge who had presided over Thomas's debt hearing. She did not react. She was very proud of herself for not reacting. She memorized his face instead, the slightly asymmetric set of his jaw, the way his left eyebrow sat a fraction higher than his right, the particular gesture he made with his ring hand when he was making a point. Then she found Frederick and touched his arm. She felt him go very still at the contact. She was almost certain he was not touched often, or not touched like that, without warning, without ceremony. And then he looked at her with the particular attention that meant he already knew something was happening. "The man by the fireplace," she murmured, close enough that no one else could hear. "The one in the brown coat. Who is he?" Frederick didn't look. This was, she was beginning to understand, characteristic. He always processed information without directing his eyes toward the source of it, a habit so ingrained it was probably unconscious. "Lord Harwick," he said, very carefully. "Edmund Harwick. He has a seat in the Lords and 3 seats on various trade committees." "Why?" "Because," Kitty told him, matching his tone with precision, "he bribed the judge who put my brother in prison." The silence between them lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was a very dense 3 seconds. "Are you certain?" "I have been certain for 14 months, she said. "I simply didn't have a name to go with the face." She felt, through the light contact of her hand on his arm, the change that moved through him. Not agitation, not surprise exactly, but the particular, focused realignment of a person who has just watched 2 separate problems resolve into a single, larger, more dangerous one. "He's not just a corrupt judge's benefactor," Frederick said. "He is the man I have been looking for. The center of the network, the one who signs nothing and touches nothing and is nonetheless responsible for all of it." "So we've found him," Kitty said. "We've found him," he agreed. "The question is what we do about it, given that he is untouchable by almost any conventional means, has friends in every institution that might hold him to account, and is currently standing 15 feet away from us, enjoying port and excellent conversation." "I didn't say it would be easy," Kitty told him. "I said we'd found him." For the first time that evening, possibly for the first time in longer than that, she felt him exhale beside her, a slow, deliberate release of something he had been holding. "No," he said, "you didn't say it would be easy." On the carriage ride back through the December streets, neither of them spoke very much. London moved past the windows in its nighttime incarnation. Torches and shadows, the smell of coal smoke, the distant sound of someone singing badly in a public house. Kitty watched it and thought about Thomas in the Marshalsea, sleeping on a cot, waiting. I'll have him moved tomorrow, Frederick said, as if she had spoken the thought aloud. Warmer quarters, better food. I should have done it sooner. She turned to look at him in the dark of the carriage. He was looking at the window, not at her. But something in the set of his shoulders had a quality she could not quite name. A kind of openness almost, as though the armour had shifted slightly out of position, and he hadn't yet decided whether to put it back. "Thank you," she said. He said nothing. But he did not look away from the window for a very long time. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Kitty's life, and she had survived enough strangeness to have a reasonably high bar. The work continued. Meetings at the tavern, information exchanged, pieces of the puzzle arranged and rearranged until the picture began to emerge with horrible clarity. Harwick ran a network that passed intelligence between England and certain parties on the continent. Not enemy governments, exactly, which would have been simple treason and therefore manageable, but private interests, financial networks, men whose loyalty ran to profit and not to country. He used legitimate trade routes as cover. He used men like Cress as couriers. He used men like Thomas as unwitting clerks who moved documents whose true contents they had no reason to suspect. Frederick assembled the evidence with a patience that Kitty found both admirable and deeply, viscerally frustrating, because the more clearly she understood what had been done and why, the harder it became to keep the cold distance she needed. It was on a Thursday evening in January 1808 that things broke. She had come to the tavern to find Frederick already there, earlier than expected, sitting with the particular stillness that she had learned to distinguish from his usual stillness. This one had a tension in it, like a clock spring wound past its natural limit. "Tell me something," she said, sitting down. "What happened with Thomas's company, Marlowe and Crane? Tell me exactly what you know." He was quiet for a moment too long. "And Frederick, I placed Thomas under surveillance," he said. 8 months before his arrest, Marlowe and Crane had been flagged as a possible conduit. At that time, I didn't know his name. I knew there was a young clerk in the company who was handling certain correspondence. I had his movements watched. I was trying to determine whether he was complicit or being used. Kitty looked at him. The candle burned between them. The tavern was empty. "You were the one who put him in the Marshalsea's path," she said, not a question. "I didn't arrange the debt. That was Harwick, who discovered the surveillance and moved first to neutralize Thomas before I could establish whether he was a witness or an accomplice. But my surveillance made Thomas visible. I drew Harwick's attention to him." A pause. "Yes." The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences she had ever experienced. It had a quality of weight to it, the weight of 14 months, of a cot in the Marshalsea, of letters she'd written that took weeks to arrive, of the way Thomas had looked the one time she'd been allowed to see him, thinner and quieter and careful in a way he hadn't been before. "You should have told me," she said. Her voice was entirely level. That was the most frightening thing about it. She knew. Not anger, not tears, just the absolute removal of warmth from something that had been warming. "I know. From the beginning. Before I agreed to any of this. I know," he said again. "Why didn't you?" Another pause. Then, with the difficulty of a man who had spent a very long time not saying things that were true, "Because I needed your help, and I was not certain you would give it if you knew. And I told myself that was a tactical decision, which it was, but it was also a cowardly one. And I am—" He stopped, started again. "I do not have a great deal of practice in telling people things that reflect poorly on me." Kitty stood up. She gathered her apron. She had still been wearing it, had come straight from the bar, and she folded it over her arm with the deliberate, focused movements of someone who needed to do something with their hands. "I need to think," she said. "Don't come back here until I've told you to." He stood also, not to stop her, she was almost certain, but because he was the kind of person who stood when someone was leaving a room, even when they were leaving because of him. Some deeply ingrained courtesy that had survived everything else. She left without looking back. She walked home through the January cold with her hands pressed against her sides, and the city loud and indifferent around her, and she did not cry until she was inside her room with the door bolted, and even then it was brief and efficient, more like a release of pressure than grief, because she had not cried in front of anyone since she was 15 and she was not about to start. What she thought about, in the long hours after, what she kept returning to, was not the betrayal itself, which was real and significant and not diminished by explanation. It was the expression on his face when he had told her, the cost of it. She had watched people lie to her face and feel nothing, had watched them lie smoothly, professionally, with complete ease, and she knew what that looked like. It did not look like that. She did not go to the tavern for 4 days. On the 5th day, she sent a note. She had not told him to come back. She had told him to meet her at the Southwark side of the bridge at 3 in the afternoon, which was neither the tavern nor his territory, nor anywhere in particular, neutral ground, which was the only kind she trusted just then. He was there when she arrived. Of course he was. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She had rehearsed it, in the way she rehearsed difficult conversations, not word for word, but the shape of it, the points she needed to make, and the order in which they needed to be made. She got approximately halfway through before he said something that dismantled the entire architecture of the prepared speech. He said, "I've been trying, for the past 4 days, to construct an argument for why what I did was justifiable, and I can't make one that I believe. I am sorry, not the useful kind of sorry, not the kind that asks you to move past it quickly because it would be more convenient, the kind that has no request attached to it. I'm sorry, and I understand if that's not sufficient, and I will not ask you for anything further." Kitty stood on the bridge with the Thames moving below them, grey and cold and indifferent, and she looked at him for a long time. "And I'm going to tell you something," she said finally, "that I haven't told anyone. The reason I know how to stay calm when men with guns walk into rooms, the reason I know how to give people partial truths that sound like whole ones, the reason I've been doing this, all of this, since I was 16. She told him about their father, about the gambling, the debts, the night he left and did not come back, and the morning she had woken up to find Thomas, 10 years old, gap-toothed, determined to be cheerful about it, trying to make breakfast out of half a loaf of bread and the ends of a piece of cheese. She told him about the jobs before the tavern, the other ones, the ones she didn't talk about, and about the year she had spent learning to read people the way you read maps, because her survival and Thomas's had depended on it. She told him all of it, not because she owed it to him and not because the telling made her feel better, but because she had decided, in the 4 days of silence, that she was done being the only person in the room who was fully visible to the other. It was not fairness she was after. It was something more like standing on equal ground. He listened with his whole body, the way he always did, completely still, entirely present. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, not with sympathy, but with the much more useful quality of recognition, "You've been doing his work, and yours both for 6 years. Yes, and you're tired." She looked at the river. Extraordinarily. "Then let me help," he said. "Not because you need it. You clearly don't, in the conventional sense, but because you shouldn't have to do it alone. And because—" Another of those pauses, the ones she had learned to read. This one contained something he had perhaps never said before. I would very much like to be the kind of person who helps you, rather than the kind who complicates your life and calls it a tactical decision." She turned to look at him. There was something almost vulnerable in his face just then. Not soft. She thought he would never quite be soft. But open in a way she had not seen before, like a window that had been painted shut for a long time and had been carefully, deliberately, unstuck. "That is a significant personal development," she told him. "I am aware. I'm not promising this is uncomplicated. Nothing worthwhile is." She was still looking at him when it happened, when she stopped bracing for it and let it be simple. She reached out and took his hand, and he closed his around hers with the careful deliberateness of a person who understood exactly what they were holding. Neither of them said anything. Below them, the Thames moved on, grey and cold, and around them, London happened at its usual relentless pace. And for approximately 4 minutes, none of it required their attention. The first time he almost smiled, she had looked away before she saw it. The second time, on the steps of the Viscount's house, she had caught only the edge of it. Standing on the bridge, his hand around hers, she saw it fully for the first time, brief and a little unsteady, as though the muscles involved were unused to the motion, but unmistakable. She decided, privately, that she was going to make it a habit. The attack on his reputation came in February 1808, and it came with the precision and timing of something planned well in advance, which it was. Harwick had been watching them. This, in retrospect, was obvious. Harwick had spent 20 years being untouchable precisely because he watched everyone, always, and moved before they could. When he had understood that Frederick was not simply an inconvenient investigator, but an investigator who had found him, and that the barmaid from the Black Stag was somehow woven into the investigation, he had done what people like Harwick always do when threatened. He had manufactured the threat somewhere else. The documents appeared in the hands of 3 separate newspapers simultaneously. They purported to show that Frederick had been selling intelligence to private interests on the continent. The same accusation he had been building against Harwick, redirected, mirrored, turned back on him with surgical efficiency. They were forgeries. Kitty knew they were forgeries because she knew, now, exactly what Frederick did and for whom. But they were excellent forgeries, and the men who needed to believe them were already half inclined to, because Frederick had never been particularly interested in being liked, and unliked men make convenient villains. The Crown suspended his access. His contact at the Home Office sent a letter that was technically polite, and actually a door closing in his face. His solicitor arrived at his house with the expression of a man delivering a death notice. Kitty heard about it through Agnes, who heard it from the morning news sheet seller on Aldgate Street, which was how most of London heard most of its important news. She went to his house. This was not a thing she had done before, and the footman looked at her with an expression she chose to ignore, and she handed him her name on a card she had written with the tavern's pen, and she waited in the hall until Frederick came down the stairs. He looked the same. This was one of the things about him that continued to unsettle her. The way difficulty registered in him, not as disruption, but as a kind of deeper stillness, as though crisis made him more himself rather than less. "I believe you," she said before he could speak. "I want to be clear about that first. I believe you, and I think I can get what we need." He looked at her for a moment. "Kitty, there is a ledger," she said. "Harwick keeps it at his house in Kensington. I know this because one of his former housemaids drinks at the Black Stag on Fridays and has very strong opinions about her former employer's organisational habits. I know where in the house he keeps it. I know when the house is lightly staffed." "Absolutely not," he said, with the quiet force of a man who had made a decision. "Charles." "The decision," Kitty told him, equally quiet, equally final, "is not yours to make." The argument that followed was the first real argument of their acquaintance, and it had the quality of 2 people who were both accustomed to being right and were discovering, with some difficulty, that being right simultaneously in opposite directions was a problem neither of them had previously encountered. He said it was too dangerous. She said she had been managing dangerous situations since before she knew his name. He said that if she were caught, it would invalidate everything. She said that if they did nothing, everything was already invalid. He said that he would not risk her. She stopped. "Say that again," she told him. He looked at her. Some of that controlled, careful distance had gone out of him. He was simply there, in the hallway of his own house, looking at her with an expression that had no armour left in it at all. "I won't risk you," he said again, quieter this time. "Then help me do it properly," she said, "instead of alone." 3 days later, on a night in early February when Harwick was attending a parliamentary dinner, and his house in Kensington was staffed by a skeleton crew. Kitty went in through the servants' entrance with a key procured through means she didn't explain to Frederick and didn't need to. He waited outside, in the street, which was the compromise they had reached. She went, because she was better at not being seen, and he was positioned to intervene if intervention became necessary. She found the ledger. She was leaving through the rear garden when the footman she hadn't accounted for appeared. Harwick had added to his staff that week, a precaution, and he was not a small man, and he had a lamp, and for approximately 30 seconds the night had the quality of a problem without a solution. Then Frederick came over the garden wall. He had heard the voices, he said afterward, matter-of-factly, as though scaling a garden wall at midnight in February were an entirely ordinary thing to do. The footman took one look at the Duke of Ashmore on the wrong side of his employer's garden wall and made the very sensible decision that this was not a situation in which his loyalty to Lord Harwick was worth his personal health. They left through the rear alley. Kitty had the ledger under her coat, pressed against her side. Her hands were completely steady. He looked at her hands. "You're not shaking." "I know." "How?" "Practice," she said. "And the knowledge that the shaking comes later, when you're somewhere safe. So the trick is to stay moving until you're somewhere safe." He looked at her for a moment in the darkness of the alley, the city loud and indifferent around them, and something crossed his face that she thought, later, was the closest thing to undone she had ever seen from him. Not broken, not lost, but briefly and completely without his usual defences. The way a landscape looks just after the weather clears. Then he tucked her hand under his arm and they walked, at a perfectly composed pace, through the streets of Kensington until they found a hackney, and then they sat in it side by side in silence all the way back to Aldgate, the ledger between them, and she let herself shake then, quietly, just a little, and he put his hand over hers and did not say anything at all, and somehow that was better than anything he could have said. 3 days after they retrieved the ledger, Thomas was released from the Marshalsea. Someone had tried to prevent the release. An injunction had been filed, on very thin legal grounds, by a solicitor whose client turned out to be one of Harwick's associates. The injunction was dismissed within 4 hours. She did not ask Frederick how. Thomas came out on a Thursday morning, thin and blinking in the February light, and Kitty was there, and the first thing he said to her was that she looked tired, and the first thing she said to him was that she was, and they stood together in the street outside the Marshalsea gate, and she held on to him until she was satisfied that he was solid and real, and actually there. Over his shoulder, at the edge of the street, she saw Frederick. He had come. He hadn't told her he was coming. He was standing well back, in the characteristically unintrusive way of someone who understood that they were witnessing something that was not about them. When he saw her looking, he made no gesture, simply looked back, with the particular expression she had come to know as his closest equivalent of warmth. She made a note of it, privately, to tell him later that it had meant something. Harwick's fall was not dramatic. This was perhaps the most satisfying thing about it. There were no dramatic revelations in a ballroom, no public confrontations, no speeches. The ledger was delivered, through Frederick's remaining contacts, to the one man in the Home Office who had both the integrity to act on it and the influence to do so without being neutralised first. The process took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Harwick attended his usual dinners, spoke in the Lords, and was impeccably unremarkable in every way. The particular performance of a man who knows the walls are closing and has decided that dignity is all he has left. In the 4th week, quietly, he resigned from his trade committee seats. In the 5th week, equally quietly, he retired to his estate in the country. The network he had built unravelled without him at the centre of it. Not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily, and with the inevitability of structures built on concealment when the concealment becomes unsustainable. Cress was taken into Crown custody on a Tuesday morning, in the back room of a different tavern entirely, one on the Wapping waterfront that he had apparently considered safer than the Black Stag, which said something about how thoroughly Kitty had redirected him that first night. He did not resist. He had, by all accounts, been expecting it for some time. Frederick told her afterward that Cress had cooperated with the intelligence service with what could only be described as relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was grateful, finally, to put it down. In exchange for his testimony against what remained of Harwick's network, he was given a new name, passage to the colonies, and the reasonable expectation of a quieter life. Kitty, when she heard this, said only that she hoped he drank somewhere with a better strongbox. Frederick was reinstated by the Crown with no public acknowledgement, because the Crown did not make public acknowledgements of this kind of work. There was a letter, that was all. He showed her the letter. She was the first person he showed it to. She was not entirely certain he would have shown it to anyone else. It says very little, she observed. It says enough. It doesn't say sorry. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She handed it back to him. Well, it's done. It's done, he said. He was quiet for a moment. They were in the tavern. It was afternoon. The place empty and bright with winter light coming through the cleaned windows. Agnes having taken the unusual step of washing them the previous week in a fit of optimism that Kitty had chosen not to discourage. "War, there is something I've been trying to say to you for some time," he continued, "and I find I'm having difficulty with the architecture of it." "That's not like you," she said. "You're usually very precise. I'm very precise about things I've done before." Kitty folded the cloth she had been using to polish the bar and set it down. She looked at him across the wood and the winter light and all the months of everything that had happened between them. "And then be imprecise," she told him. "I'll understand you anyway. I usually do." He met her eyes. Something in him was still, genuinely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his exposure, but the stillness of someone who has arrived, finally, at a place he intended to be. "I don't want to go back to the way things were before this," he said. "Before you. I have been a particular kind of alone for a very long time, and I had made a certain peace with it. And I find that I am no longer able to maintain that peace with any sincerity, because of you, because of the way you refused to be afraid of me, and the way you argued with me, and the way you stayed calm on a bridge in January and told me the truth about your whole life without asking for anything in return." He paused. "Oh, because you made me want to be worth trusting, and I don't know if I fully am, yet, but I would very much like the chance to become so." Kitty let the silence sit for a moment. Not because she was uncertain. She had been certain about this for longer than she had wanted to admit. In the way you can be certain about something and still need time to let the certainty settle into the rest of your life. "You said that fairly precisely," she told him. "I had some time to prepare." "How much time?" A pause. "Several weeks." She laughed, a short, surprised sound, not performed for his benefit but genuine, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can organize it. He looked startled, and then the corner of his mouth moved, and then, slowly, as though the motion were still finding its natural rhythm, he smiled. Not the almost smile of the corner table, not the suppressed impulse she had been catching in fragments for months. A real smile, full and unhurried, belonging to his face as though it had always been there and had simply been waiting for a reason. It changed him entirely, not into someone else, into more himself, somehow, as though all the precision and severity had been scaffolding around something that simply needed the scaffolding removed. She came around the bar. He was standing at the corner table, his table, the one where it had all started, the brandy glass and the gold sovereign and the November dark, and she stopped in front of him close enough that there was nothing casual about the distance. "I want it clearly understood," she said, looking up at him, "that I will not be managed or redirected when I have decided to do something, or kept out of things on the basis that they are dangerous, because I've been in dangerous things since I was 16, and I have an excellent record." "Understood," he said, with the particular gravity of a man making a genuine commitment. "And I will not pretend to be a cousin from Wiltshire again. If I'm in a room with you, I'm in it as myself. You were always more yourself than anyone else in that room, he said. The cousin from Wiltshire was a transparent fiction. It worked. You would have worked without it. She put her hand flat against his chest, felt the steadiness of him, the warmth, the contained force of someone who was holding very still, because stillness was how he held things carefully. And she looked up at him and waited. He kissed her the way she had come to understand he did most things. Completely. No half measures. All of his attention, which was considerable, focused on the single point of her, and she kissed him back with the same quality of commitment, because she had never been interested in half measures either, and this was not the kind of moment that deserved anything less than the whole of it. When they separated, she kept her hand where it was. His was at her jaw, tilted slightly, as though he had not entirely decided to stop. Thomas wants to meet you, she told him. I know. He sent me a letter. She pulled back to look at him. He sent you a letter. 3 days ago. It was very politely worded and contained only one mild threat, which I thought showed considerable restraint. He's been in prison for 14 months, Kitty said. And the first thing he does is threaten a duke. On your behalf, it was, Frederick said, with the careful precision of a man who was being honest even when the honesty was slightly embarrassing. One of the most endearing letters I've ever received. She stared at him. You thought it was endearing. Your brother, whom I have never met, took the time to locate my address, source the appropriate paper, write in a legible hand despite presumably being out of practice, and inform me that if I were to cause you further grief of any kind, he had friends, he underlined friends, who would be unhappy to hear of it. And then he signed it with his full name and address. A pause. Hi, I found it endearing, yes. You are a very strange man, Kitty told him. You've known that for some time, he pointed out. I have, she agreed. I've decided to keep you anyway. Thomas Marlowe recovered, as people who have been briefly but unjustly pressed under the wheel tend to recover, not entirely unmarked, but with a resilience that the experience had tested rather than destroyed. He was 20 years old, and he had spent 14 months in a place designed to reduce a person, and he had come out the other side still capable of writing politely threatening letters to dukes, which Kitty felt was a reasonable indicator of character. He met Frederick in April, in the back room of the Black Stag on a Sunday afternoon when the place was closed, and Agnes had been given the day off, and Kitty had made tea with the good leaves she kept for occasions that deserved them. The meeting lasted 3 hours. She was present for approximately 40 minutes of it, during which time she watched her brother and the most feared man in London discover, apparently to both their mild surprise, that they had several opinions in common about the failures of the current shipping regulatory structure. She excused herself to see to something in the bar and came back to find them deep in argument about something she gathered was related to naval provisioning contracts, which was either a good sign or an extremely peculiar one. She chose, privately, to call it a good sign. The Black Stag continued. It was that kind of place, built to outlast its occasions. Agnes got a raise. The sign stopped creaking because someone anonymous had oiled the hinges, which Agnes claimed not to know anything about, and Frederick refused to confirm or deny. The strongbox contained rather more than 11 shillings and 4pence. Frederick did not move his corner table. He came when he came, and she always knew he was there before she looked up. The way you know a familiar weather pattern from the feeling in the air before the clouds arrive. He came after closing sometimes, still, and they sat at the corner table with whatever was left in the bottle and talked about things that were not intelligence operations, or sometimes were, because neither of them had entirely left that territory, and both of them were constitutionally unsuited to the merely ordinary. London moved around them as it always had, loud, particular, entirely indifferent to the private revolutions occurring within it. In drawing rooms and assembly halls, society continued to find the Duke of Ashmore somewhat alarming, which he considered a functional outcome. The tavern girl, who had become, somehow, a regular feature of the Duke of Ashmore's company, was the subject of considerable discussion in various quarters, most of which could be summarized as bewilderment, not hostile, Exactly. But searching. The bewilderment of people who understand the rules and cannot reconcile what they are seeing with those rules. Kitty, who had never found the rules particularly useful, was entirely unbothered by this. On a morning in late April, she came down to open the tavern and found Frederick already there. This was not unusual now. He had his own key, a development that had been formally presented to her as a practical matter and received by her as something considerably more significant, which he had pretended not to notice her noticing. He was sitting at the corner table with a cup of tea. She had taught him how to make it properly, which had been a week-long negotiation, and the morning light was coming through the windows at the particular angle that made the old wood of the bar look like something valuable. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and put her hand on the back of the chair across from him. "You're early," she told him. "I was awake. You're always awake. You're always here." "It's my tavern," she pointed out. "Yes," he agreed, "it is." He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued over the course of these months as belonging specifically to her, not the assessment, not the focus, but the open, unhurried attention of someone who has arrived somewhere they intend to stay. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get you tea." She sat down. He got up and went to the bar, and she heard the familiar sounds of the morning: kettle, cups, the small domestic routine of a man who had learned his way around her kitchen, with the same thorough attention he brought to everything else. She looked at the morning light on the walls of the room she had worked in for 6 years, and thought about the night in November when a duke had left a sovereign on her bar, and how she had picked it up and turned it over and known, with the bone-deep instinct of someone who had learned to count threats, that it was the beginning of something she could not yet name. She had not been wrong. She had simply underestimated the size of it. He came back with 2 cups and set one in front of her with the careful deliberateness that was so entirely characteristic of him, the way he handled everything he cared about, as though the care itself were the message. She picked up the cup. The tea was exactly right. "You've got the mornings," she told him. "I've got the evenings. We'll take the afternoons as they come." He looked at her over his cup with the expression that was still, even now, slightly unsteady, as though the happiness were a thing he kept almost expecting to lose, and kept finding, each time he looked, that it had stayed. "That sounds," he said carefully, "like an arrangement I can commit to." "Good." She took a sip of her tea. Outside, London was waking up. Carts and voices, and the particular noise of a city that never fully slept, just rested briefly and impatiently. "Now, are you going to tell me why you were actually awake at this hour? Or shall I guess?" The corner of his mouth moved. "You'll guess wrong." "I never guess wrong." "You guessed the brandy was 4 pence. It was 4 pence. It was 6, he said. "I let you have the argument." Kitty Marlowe stared at him. Then she put down her cup. "You," she told the Duke of Ashmore, slowly and with great feeling, "are going to be a great deal of trouble." He smiled, fully, easily, the smile that had been waiting all this time for the right room to exist in. "You've known that?" he said. For quite some time. She had. She had known it from the moment she found the sovereign on the bar, cold and deliberate and impossible to ignore. She picked up her cup again. He picked up his. Outside, the city was loud and alive and completely indifferent to the two of them in the corner of an old tavern, building something unhurried and precise and theirs. It was, all things considered, an excellent morning. If this story found you, share it, follow for more, and tell me in the comments which moment made you certain she was going to be his undoing.